I went through myself. So one of the reasons why I love what I get to do, which is to work with students and guide them through the process, is that I myself was a pre-med many, many years ago. And so I've been working with pre-medical students. And when I say pre-med, first of all, it means it encompasses all other health professions as well. Although most students who are pre-health will fall under the pre-med because they want to go on to become a physician. So for today's conversation, when I say pre-med, I mean, don't feel like if you're interested in dentistry or pharmacy that this is not applicable to you, because it actually is. So, all right. So when we're talking about pre-med, one of the things that is frequently on the minds of students and parents, depending on what stage of the educational journey, is what does one need to do? Which is a very valid question to ask. Because very often when we're thinking about a destination, we get focused on like, how do I get there? What do I need to do? Which is, again, a very valid question to ask. But the truth of the matter is that I think all of us, especially us parents, I mean, when did we know exactly what we wanted to be when we, got older? I mean, it's a process. So whether you're speaking to a college counselor, a high school counselor, one of the first things you need to figure out is, do you know who you are? And obviously that's sort of a very ambiguous and amorphous question, one that takes time and a lot of life experience to help facilitate that process. So with all of that said, I mean, here's what we do know in my industry called pre-health and pre-med, is that with the pandemic, the demand and interest for a health profession has only gone up. And medical schools have already seen as much as a 30% or higher increase in the number of applications they are receiving. So, some people thought that maybe the pandemic would, cause people to run the other way. Like, wow, why do I want to go into a profession that's going to put me in harm's way? But then, of course, we knew that for some, it would be the opposite effect, which is, wow, this is an area of need. There's a tremendous opportunity here, and I want to be on the front lines. So that's kind of what's going on now in terms of, again, working with many students and families over the years. Question is, what should they be doing? And again, this is where I have to go back to what I know is absolutely critical, which is you need to figure out what is of interest to you. What are your strengths and talents? I mean, we get so focused on the destination that we frequently overlook the process, which again, when we're talking about education, and speaking of the process of education, let me share with you where I'm coming from, so you have a context. And I know, Trevor, you were kind enough to share a little bio about my background. But again, for those of you that haven't had a chance, I've been in education for about 23 years. And that tenure has included time as a classroom teacher, as a middle school science teacher for LA Unified School District. I was a substitute for Torrance Unified School District. I've taught at the undergraduate level when I was at USC. I was at USC for about an 8-year tenure in higher education. And then currently I serve as the post-bac program director at the Keck Graduate Institute in Claremont, California. So again, just a very long tenure in education. And again, for me, I really fell in love with working with that pre-health population because it captures so much of my own experience. And as the son of immigrants who did not speak English nor understood the educational system here in the US, I had to learn a lot of this on my own. And so it's just been a real pleasure for me to work with students and families. And it's just, the way I like to describe it is it's kind of like a tour guide. Does someone need to have a tour guide to go on a vacation to some exotic country that they've never been to? Well, these days, I mean, you would agree with me that if you have a phone, you don't need anything. I mean, you got TripAdvisor, you have Yelp, you have Google reviews, and you have all kinds of resources available to help you navigate that vacation. But again, I think this is where, you have to understand that there are no guarantees that if you use a certain price match or, retail source to get your best ticket price, the best car rental price, and you do all your due diligence that you're going to have a great vacation. There are no guarantees. And that's probably one of the most important takeaways I hope your viewers today really understand about this process. And I know that your audience consists of high school and undergraduate students, and anybody who is familiar in the least bit with education and mission knows that it's not an exact science, that just having the best GPA or the best test scores does not mean you get an acceptance. And I have to tell your viewers here that the health profession graduate programs, that holds so true. I've seen students get into medical school with college GPAs as low as 2.5. Now, some of you are dancing up and down with joy because you just heard something that you never thought would be even possible. But again, it's about the process. It isn't this like, if you do X, Y, and Z, you get this specific outcome. And the analogy, I use a lot of analogy when I'm working with students because I think they're just so easy to understand and it makes it fun. So it's kind of like when you are applying for a job. I know that some of you are, maybe the students are a little bit younger and you haven't, had your first real job. So you're gonna have to trust us when we say, when there is a job posting, whether it's on LinkedIn, Indeed, or any of these job sites, a job posting goes up. In that job posting, there will be requirements for that position. You have to be able to speak English, read, write, and communicate. You have to have your own reliable transportation. Maybe that position requires a bachelor's degree. There's a set of requirements. But if you look a little further down, most of us who've been in the workforce know this. There's these preferred qualifications, aren't there? These preferred qualifications are asking for, do you speak another language? Do you understand and know this type of software or computer technologies? There are these additional preferred qualifications. Well, the way the admission works is very similar to that. They have these basic requirements you need to have. So for example, if you're thinking about going into the health professions, you have to have a pretty solid science foundation. Now, sometimes what happens is, students and families think that you have to be a science major, that you have to be a bio major, because it is the most common major for those that are pursuing the health professions. Well, they got to be a biology major or molecular biology or virology or some variation of the biological sciences. Well, the truth is you don't have to major in that. In fact, I would argue that you are actually in a slight advantage when you are not a science major. Because remember, our brain notices anomalies. It pays attention to novelty. When something is different, right, it just kind of jumps out at you. I got a young kid who used to love watching Blue's Clues. I think there's like 4 items on the picture and one doesn't belong. And it just pops out right at you what that is. Okay. So again, if you are thinking about your interest in the health profession, I know the expectation was, oh, great, I'm going to find out all the secrets today in this webinar. I'm going to figure out what those secrets are. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to get the results. I hate to tell you this, but that's not how it works. Very frequently, again, this is over my tenure of being in education at all grade levels, we frequently get focused on the educational decision, the selection. Which classes should I take? Which school should I apply to? Which SAT prep is the best? Which medical school is the best? We get so fixated on that choice. But if I just share with you one example of how choice is sort of misguided and that should not be the focus, I hope you understand. So it has to do with a common New Year's resolution. I don't know if it's still common, but when I was certainly growing up, it was a very common New Year's resolution, which is you're going to get fit. You're going to get that 6-pack ab and you're going to get super built and chiseled. But what do? So most people look at joining a gym, right? So they're going to look at these gyms, like which gym should I join? Which one's got the best equipment? Which one has the finest facilities? You get so into the research of choosing that gym membership. But I think you guys can already sense where I'm going with all this, which is the final bottom line outcome whether you get those six packs, whether you hit your fitness goals, is not so much dependent on your choice of which gym you join, but it really has to do with the process of what you are going to do when you are there. And again, having worked with undergraduates previously, now graduate students, it's the same thing. Students get so fixated on, if I choose the right program, somehow the momentum or the currents of success will take you there. And so being pre-med is very, very similar. You can do the right things, in your mind, but again, that does not necessarily lead to an acceptance. So there's an expression that I've been using for, I want to say, about 4 years, could be 5, but not, it's a more recent, usage of this expression, but I think it's a very good one. And that is, it's not what you do, but it's who you are. Once again, I think it's so important. I'll repeat it. It's not what you do, but it's who you are. And so this is where, when one is thinking about going into medicine, what should I do? Should I go volunteer at the hospital? Check. Should I do research? Check. Should I be a science major? Check. And it's really this, mindset that most who are unfamiliar have about being successful in the health profession, is that if you do these things, you will get this result. And really, you need to focus on that exploration. And so the way I would convey it is, listen, don't do the hospital volunteer because it leads to looking good on an application, but you really need to focus on it because you need to figure out if this is for you. So again, it kind of makes perfect sense. Think about Costco. I love Costco. Whenever my family goes to Costco, well, since the pandemic, we haven't enjoyed it, but before the pandemic, they have samples. Who doesn't love a good Costco samples? We want to test it out and see if we want it or not. Well, that's the reason why, if you're a student and you think you're interested in being a doctor, a pharmacist, or whatever it might be, you want to get out there and see what that's all about. Now, obviously, right now with the pandemic, it is harder because of the regulations and safety protocols that, getting those types of exposure and experiences is a barrier, but it's not impossible. Because you have to understand, life still goes on during a pandemic. There's still patients and people going to receive care. So I have current students that are very much involved right now. They're still in the clinical setting. Some of them are doing it as a volunteer, and some of them are employed, but nonetheless, they're getting those valuable experiences because they need to figure out if that is what they really want. Now, I have a saying, what's worse than not getting into med school? Because again, students think that is the most important thing. I worked my butt off all these years, all those staying up late, pulling all-nighters, sacrificing fun social events and vacations and trips with friends so I could study. Okay. What's worse than not getting in is to get in and be miserable and maybe even drop out. Some students will change their mind. And I have worked with some students where that has happened, where they worked really hard. They did get that acceptance, the work that they worked so hard for. But once they got there, they realized it is not what it's all cracked up to be. And so getting in that case, was worse than not getting in, because they also took out loans. And I know when it comes to any type of financial matters, Trevor, that's your area, and I will be more than happy to share students and direct them your way in terms of finances and scholarship opportunities and all that good stuff. But to going back to about this whole, what should you do to prepare? Figure out what are your interests and what is it this health profession all about. I have another expression that I share. Health careers, it requires science. It requires quite a bit of science and knowledge and understanding of the sciences. But those careers are really about people. It's really about the patients. And I know for some younger students, maybe if you're in high school, you kind of get that gist of that idea, but I really challenge you to get involved. Your local hospitals, clinics, these types of places, they are always in need of additional help. Now, sometimes what students will say is, well, there's this place, there's a, hospital nearby, but then when I inquired, it's a lot of like not glamorous grunt work. Well, think about it. What are they going to do? Invite you in and have you, be a first assist on a surgical procedure? Of course not. You're going to need to get your, foot in the door, get an understanding of the environment, just even being exposed in that environment where there's lots of emotions, right? I mean, the hospital is one of those places where you're gonna be surrounded by a whole spectrum of emotions, everything from the elation and the absolute joy of maybe a family bringing in a new baby into their family, right? So that's the maternity ward. A lot of students who are more happy and just sort of an upbeat personality, they might be drawn to obstetrics. But those who are more into pressure situations, they're probably going to be more drawn to emergency medicine. So again, all of this to say that if you're someone who has an inkling of interest in the health professions, go ahead and get yourself some exposure to that. Maybe if you're lucky enough, you have a family member or a family friend who work already in healthcare, and you might be able to get some shadowing. Shadowing is exactly that, shadowing, meaning that you just follow and you observe, obviously with proper safety protocols and whatnot. But again, just observation, what we call shadowing. Is it a requirement? Some programs might say, yes, we require at least 50 hours or 100 hours or whatever that might be, but know that, you should still do that even if it's not a requirement. Because very often I think the mentality is, okay, listen, I already know I want this and just tell me how to get it, is kind of the mentality of some of the students I have worked with over the years. And what's interesting, or not surprising, I should say, is when they are asked a question. So, why do you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to be a medical doctor? They kind of look at you like, well, duh. I mean, I've wanted to be a doctor ever since I was 5 years old and I got my first stethoscope toy kit. I've always wanted to be a doctor. I can't imagine being anything else. Well, if you slow down and think about that, that's not a very strong response. And in fact, it's a horrible one. And it's one that unfortunately a lot of students who aren't, well prepared, that's what they say during an interview, is that, well, I just really enjoy helping people. I really love science. Well, come on, let's think about it. You love science, you like helping people. Of course, being a physician is the only way to do that. And obviously, you can hear the sarcasm that no, there are many other ways, but you need those experiences to base your, sort of conclusions that I know I want to be in medicine because, and then be able to refer to specific examples of the times that you were involved. So I would just kind of slow down and stop right there. I mean, I think that's a good stopping place where, if you have that initial interest, right, even before taking the right classes, because I think sometimes students will say, well, tell me what classes I need. Okay, well, let's put this in the proper order. Is that what you even want? And then right after, or maybe concurrently, maybe I would concede concurrently, while you're volunteering at the hospital or clinic, that you take some of those absolute necessary prerequisites. Courses like biology, chemistry, physics. For med schools, you want to take physics, but for PA school, physician assistant, you don't have to have physics. So again, the prerequisites, you guys can find all that information all online. The prerequisite stuff and what are the requirements to get in. That's like looking at job postings and saying, oh my gosh, look, this job requires reading and writing skills. This job requires English proficiency. It's kind of a given. But you need to figure out, do you even want that job in the first place? That, job posting. Maybe that's not a job for you. So this is what where I would just say, listen, if you think you're interested in the health professions, go ahead and figure out if that's truly what you want to do. At least, yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, Trevor, come on in. It's a conversation, and anybody else. And it looks like Rosabella's in here. So I welcome questions. I mean, I want it to be a very, productive conversation, because my philosophy is, if it's purely just about information, the internet's full of information, right? Trevor, you know that. I mean, there's tons of information out there, but how do you reconcile? How do you synthesize all this information that's out there? And that's where you and I and other subject matter experts kind of come together, and we're able to sort of, simplify, if you will. But go ahead. What question?
Yeah, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. To me, I think these webinars are mostly about context. Um, so I got a feeling that most of the people that are going to watch this are pre-med students, just based on some of the messages that I got originally. But yeah, there's certain things in your head that you have to overcome to even go about doing this. And some of these things I want to bring up, and it was a very interesting how you answered a lot of the questions that people have in their mind just by what you said. Like what should I major in and things like that. But I do have a question. So what is a good reason to apply to medical school?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question, because I actually want to borrow a quote from a colleague of mine. And she tells her students that you don't apply to med school unless you have to, which is kind of a funny way to answer that question. But all of this to say that it is something that you are just, this is something that you want so badly, that it is the way you want to live that one life that you have been given. This is the way you want. Now, there is a contrasting side to this, because there are some physicians who absolutely believe that it is a calling, that it is something more than, now even students are aware that there's a difference between a job and a career. But this is where we could even further differentiate and say, no, this is not even a career. This is like your purpose on this planet, right? There's this sort of higher calling and reason for why you're drawn to it. But you have the other side, which is you have people who will say, well, you don't have to. This isn't your entire life. This is truly a profession, albeit a very important and noble profession with a lot of responsibilities and great deal of privilege. But, it is, at the end of the day, another job. I have a family that comes before my patients. And, so there is an interesting contrast of people who go into medicine. But really, when that question of, why do you want to? And sometimes a little tweak is all you need. I would challenge my students, don't ask yourself, why do you want to be a doctor? Ask yourself, how do you know you want to be a doctor, right? Ooh, let's take a pause there, because we got to let that sink in a little bit. Why do you want to be a doctor versus how do you know you want to be a doctor? There is a difference. And so this is where, again, I mean, you have to trust the process and the journey. It's like, I tell my teenage kids, when we're on a trip, we're visiting, somewhere new and it's exciting, they are seeing everything through their phone. They're taking pictures and video of everything, which I'll tell them, listen, I know you want to take a picture and video because you want to, maybe see it and hear it later at another time, but you're missing out. You're not in the moment. Mindfulness is really, really a popular concept these days. We might have heard it referred by living in the moment, right? Because we're constantly thinking about the past, what we should have done, what we could have done, or we get so fixated on the future, like what I'm going to do next week and what should I be doing for next year, instead of like living right now in the moment. And so in terms of, how do they answer that question? I mean, don't be afraid. And I think your students already know this, because gap year has become such an acceptable practice between high school and even college. So I would definitely, recommend, if you don't know, when in doubt, take time off, right?
Okay.
Yep.
Here's another one. So other than the title,
yep,
and presumably the money, what would be a reason why someone would choose to be a nurse instead of a doctor?
Yep. Very good question. It's like you're one of my pre-health students. Yes. So there are certain professions that are very similar. They overlap. So we're familiar with Venn diagrams. I mean, think of the health profession as just one big, poster with all these overlapping circles, right? Because at the core is you're taking care of people, you're helping people, but the manner in which you carry that out, the execution of it looks very different. it's no different than, remember I told you I love analogies. I love sports. So it's like comparing and contrasting like a wide receiver with a quarterback and a safety and a running back. I mean, you guys are all playing football. Football is football. The rules of football are the same, but depending on your position, your role, what you will be doing is different. And so a physician is sort of the primary go-to point person for a patient. I mean, it's sort of what we might say, starts with them and ends with them. I mean, they are the one that is providing the overall care for that individual. They also have a lot of professional autonomy. So their real focus, along with PAs, by the way, PAs are, when you look at the education and training of physician assistants, I'm just going to use PAs moving forward. PAs and physicians are very similar. And that's why most PA programs will be organizationally structured under the School of Medicine. Although UC Davis is an exception. UC Davis, their PA program is housed in the School of Nursing. And nursing is different. Nursing is truly taking care of the patients. I think we all at some point have had experience with our healthcare system. And we can probably refer to those experiences where doctors, they come in, they ask you how you're doing. They quickly go right to what's the problem? What are the symptoms? How long have you been in pain? And on a scale of 1 to 10, because that's because the physicians and PAs are focused on figuring out what the problem is so that they can help you fix it. Whereas the nurses, they're not treating you, they are not diagnosing. That is not within their scope of practice. Their true sort of scope of practice is to take care of the patients, right? Making sure they're comfortable. If they are running low on certain medication, to notify the physician. And so that's sort of the difference between, being a physician and being nursing or being a nurse. But there's also obviously so many other health professions, a physical therapist, for example, a dentist, right? So how do you just choose? Well, what we do know, Trevor, is that media, right, no surprise, has quite a bit of influence on what people decide. If there is a cool show about surgeons, turns out that medical school applications goes up. And if there's a cool show on law, right? I mean, there's quite a few of shows, on that deal with crime and law, and applications for those programs go up. But here's the thing. I mean, what cool program has been out there regarding a dentist? Not really. How about a podiatrist, a doctor who takes care of people's feet? Not really. An audiologist? Has there been a TV or a movie glamorizing audiologists? No, they're just, they're not in the spotlight. And so for those reasons, a lot of students are unaware of these amazing other health professions, because again, if all you're backing up, justifying your decision to pursue becoming a doctor is, well, I love science, I find the human body fascinating, and physiology is my favorite class, and I want to help people. I mean, there's hundreds of health professions. Occupational therapy is a very up and coming health profession. Occupational therapy has nothing to do with helping people find jobs, because as soon as people hear occupation, it's like, whoa, I'm not into that. No, occupational therapy really is about how to help people live a quality of life. I mean, occupation by definition in a medical setting, clinical setting definition, is what we do with our time. Like what occupies our time. It's obviously eating, sleeping, hobbies and interests, going to work, for example. It's the everyday thing and activity that we don't think about. Like we all had breakfast today, hopefully. Did we think about how we were going to hold the spoon and what angle we were going to feed ourselves? Of course not, because for the most part, we're probably all healthy and are not, recovering some type of injury. But imagine someone who's been in a car accident and has lost their ability to use their hand. What are they going to do, right? I mean, obviously, you can hire assistants to feed you, but occupational therapists would work with you to help you become self-sufficient. And what are some alternative ways that you can go about being able to do the everyday things that you need to do? So occupational therapy is great. I mean, we have, trying to PA right now is probably, I would say, U.S. labor statistics. I think it's either number one, definitely in the top three. It's
so that's my question then. So, who is the PA path good for? Because I'm assuming that people that are watching this want to work at a hospital. That's so that's why we're covering like nursing.
Yeah.
But like, who is it good for?
Yeah. If you have like an instinctual, an innate desire to care for and serve others, a very authentic, altruistic sort of disposition, right? Your desire to help others in a way that also has to involve an appreciation and joy for sciences. I mean, again, it's not sufficient, but it is necessary, right? Like, just because you want to help people and you're good at the sciences doesn't automatically mean that you would want to nor become a successful physician or care provider, but it's certainly an important initial step. So for anyone who is fascinated by, just figuring out what's going on, right? How do you help these people? They're in pain. They're in this predicament and they don't know what to do. I mean, that sort of is a good first step. And for me, as I had shared with everyone, I mean, I thought I wanted to go into medicine. I was a bio major. I did my undergrad at UCLA, one of literally thousands that, I think I want to be a doctor. And for me and for many students, when they're writing up their personal statement. So the personal statement, as we all know, is basically, why do you want to go into this path? Or why do you want to go into med school or pharmacy, whatever it might be? And that's where you write about yourself and sort of help the admission committee members understand your motivation for wanting to pursue that. So for me, it's very typical. As a young child, I used to have seizures. So I am familiar with, the healthcare system. And I had a neurologist who was my doctor, Dr. Green. And I just remember saying, I want to be just like Dr. Green. I want to take care of people and help, when they're suffering from these types of illnesses. So again, it's just that familiarity that becomes sort of the initial starting point for, I want to be a doctor. So
yeah.
You know what I mean? It's very, very common. If it's not yourself with a medical condition, it's like grandma with Alzheimer's, it's grandpa with diabetes. I mean, but the truth of the matter is, who doesn't know someone who's sick, right? And who doesn't have a grandparent who is getting older in age and, their time with us is going to expire. I mean, but that alone is insufficient to say, I want to go be a doctor. I mean, that would mean everybody's got to go be a doctor, because everyone has grandparents who are going to die and everyone's got sick loved ones. So again, this is where, you have to have this, we hear that P word, passion. We hear it a lot. And so this is where you need to have that self-awareness.
Okay? Yeah. So Dr. Kim, I'm going to ask you some kind of rapid fire, because I realized how little I know about this process, and just in case we have some parents on the line too. Okay, so on that PA question though, like let's just let's just keep it 100, right? So you already said that physics is not a requirement. So is a PA program as competitive as medical school?
So competitive, let's define competitive. If we're defining competitive as the number of applications received and number of spots available, which one has the lower percentage? It's actually, believe it or not, Trevor, it's PA. PA programs are much more competitive than med school. And so my running joke with the population of students that I work with is, hey, listen, if you can't get into PA school, you might want to use med school as a backup. And while that is sort of counterintuitive, it's factually accurate if you define selectivity as number of spots. And that has to do with the fact that PA schools are usually much smaller. They have as few as 20 seats, 40 seats, and yet they receive literally, thousands up to, depending on which PA program, 6,000, 7,000 applications for those few limited seats. Med schools typically have, anywhere from 150 to about 200 seats, and it varies. And the prerequisites for PA, there are more prerequisites for PA. And the reason for that is PA is much shorter. PA is 2 years, med school is 4 years. PA, you need to have all that clinical experience up front. They, in fact, even have requirements. You need to have, 500 hours of patient care experience. You need 1,000 healthcare hours of experience. So that clinical requirement is up front. Now, that's a very different story when you look at med schools. Med schools, you don't have to have that of an intense clinical experience up front because your education is going to be 4 years. It's double the duration of PA. Not only that, a lot of the clinical experiences that you'll gain is when will happen in your years 3 and 4 of medical school. Although these days there are some med schools that recognize that they want to expose their med students earlier to the clinical settings. So some med schools these days, they will start them off the very first semester of medical school exposed to patient care. And that kind of just sounds very odd that, wait a minute, so you can get into med school with 0 healthcare experience? No, I wouldn't say 0. But when we're comparing PAs to med school applicants don't need as many or as much experience and exposure as the PA applicant, but they do need it. I mean, med school applicants need it because, again, when you think about med school admissions, I mean, there's basically two questions that you need to be able to answer, and it needs to be, obviously the right answer. Number one, does the applicant have what it takes to be successful in medical school? Because medical school admission committees do not want to admit students who are not going to make it to the finish line, right? It's kind of common sense. They're going to try to assess whether an individual is going to be successful in their medical school, because no one wants to admit a student who's going to struggle, drop out, because let's face it, med schools do not want empty seats, just as airlines don't want empty seats when the plane's up in the air. And so you want to make sure that students are going to be successful once they get to med school. Now, how do you think they answer that question, Trevor? They've never met the student, right? And even before getting an interview, they don't know about the student. So what do they base that decision on? Whether someone's going to be what they think will be successful or not. What do you think they look at? GPA, right? They look at GPA, and for med school, it would be the MCAT. They look at these to try to predict, is this candidate going to be academically fine for med school? Because they do not want to accept. In fact, I could even argue it's unethical to accept a student that is going to struggle and is not prepared to do well in medical school. So that's the first.
I want to get to that too, but what's the other thing?
The other thing is fine. You have the ability to whiz through med school because you're so brilliant. You're super smart, but is it your thing? I mean, is this what you're passionate about? Is medicine, is being a physician, is being that care provider, the leader of the healthcare team, right? Remember that football analogy? Yeah, a physician, you're like the quarterback. You kind of have to know all your teammates' position, like what they do, because you are the leader. I mean, you're the one that will refer you. You know what? This specific condition that you have, I'm going to refer you out to a specialist because this is not my area. And it could be an oral surgeon, it could be a podiatrist, it can be some other person that's outside of their scope of expertise.
So then that's a question. Should you go to medical school if you don't want to work with patients?
No. So this is where, I have worked with some students who are really into medical examinations, like post-mortem, right? They want to figure out how this person died. And so basically they're interested in pathology. You can certainly go that route, but again, this is where you kind of need to do your research, not just the intellectual research, but your experiential research, right? I mean, just because you know something doesn't mean you understand it. So this is why, talking to people, getting those exposures and experiences, so you absolutely know what you're getting yourself into. Because going back to that second part, number one, they got to make sure that you're not at academic risk. Number two, that this is really your thing. I remember there was a time I was working with a student, triple major. This student had I don't think they had a 4.0, but they had like a 3.9 something. mean, super brilliant guy, right? So he asked me if I could write a letter of recommendation for him, and I couldn't. And the hesitation was, I just don't think he had that intrinsic desire to, and the empathy, right? We hear that word a lot. You know, someone who has that connection with others to sort of have those, and we hear it in various expressions, bedside manners, right? Do
You
they
couldn't go
have?
to medical school if you just wanted to do like medical research, like.
Yeah, so PhD would, I mean, and that actually is what's happened to many of the students I've worked with. And again, it's a journey, right? You're trying to help them figure out what they want. So going back to my gym analogy, well, they say they want six pack, they want to get chiseled, but after you work with them, it turns out that's not what they want. What they really want is they want to be healthy. Well, guess what? You don't have to have a six pack to be healthy. Thank you. I mean, or else I'd be very unhealthy. You know, they just want to be healthy. So, you know, this is why in my near 20 years of working with pre-med students, the average age of matriculating students just keeps ticking up higher and higher and higher, which kind of makes sense, right? I mean, do you really want to invest? First of all, applying to med school is not cheap. I mean, literally, it's going to be about $4,000 to $7,000 just purely on the cost of applying. And if you're fortunate enough to get interviews, you're going to have to travel. Although, with the pandemic and many med schools using virtual interviews, maybe some schools will continue to use exclusively an online format. And so applicants can save money there. But even still, I can't imagine, you know, all the schools or even the majority of the schools saying, you know what, we're just going to do all virtual interviews. So flights, hotels, all that add up, not to mention just the sheer cost of the tuition itself. A U.S. medical school can be anywhere from $160,000 4 years. It could go as high as above $300,000. So it's
one of the questions that I had too. So that was great.
Yeah, it's a huge investment. It's a huge, huge investment. I mean, obviously, most of us would say, you know, the house is the largest purchase. Well, it depends. I mean, if you're not in New York City, Chicago, LA, and you know you're somewhere in the Midwest where the real estate is a lot more reasonable, no, your education becomes the highest purchase in your lifetime.
So talking to, say, a high school student and the parent of a high school student, what makes one pre-med program better than another?
Oh, I love this question. You know why I love this question? Because it has to do with decision making. And my doctoral dissertation, my research was on decision making. So here's what we know about decisions. When our brain is trying to make a decision, we are focusing on the differences, not the similarities, right? I mean, think about it. We want to buy some widget on Amazon. Are we really going to look at all the people selling that widget and figuring out what they have in common? No, right? We look at the differences. Well, first of all, we would look at who's selling it cheaper, right? It's like, oh, I'm going with the cheaper. Okay, now you've narrowed it down. You got like 10 people selling it for the same price. Well, guess what? You're not going to buy all 10 of them because you only need one widget, right? So you're going to narrow it down. So how do you narrow it down? Very frequently, my students would say, I look at the reviews. Fine. You want to get rid of all the 3-star reviews? You only want to consider the people with 5-star reviews, which is, you know, fair. But here's the problem. Even if you narrow it down to 5-star reviews, what do you think you're going to find? Now you have 22 sellers with 5-star reviews. So how else would you narrow that down? Students would say, you got to look at the number of reviews because some people only have like 5 reviews and that's why they have 5 stars. Whereas someone has like 6,326. So you go with, you know, the person who has more reviews. Okay, now you've narrowed it down to about 8. So you keep narrowing it down, right? And so this is where, continuing with this analogy, we're looking for the difference. Oh, this one, shipping's included in their price. Or maybe some of you would have said, no, I would have looked at that much, much earlier in this funnel. Absolutely, right? You would look at whether shipping is additional or if it's included. You know, is there a return policy more generous than this one? So all of this to say, Trevor, when we're deciding, we're looking at differences. So your question of, well, these med schools, what are the differences? What should they be looking at? Well, the truth of the matter is, I mean, this decision making is the same and very comparable to all your high schoolers looking at undergraduate colleges. Remember, I work with high schoolers, I work with undergraduates. I even was part of that world of undergraduate college admissions. So, what are they looking at? And I think familiarity, prestige is usually at the top, right?
Right.
No one wants to go to a school that no one's ever heard of, because it just doesn't feel good when you're, at an event and someone asks, hey, where are you going? Or if you're parents and you have a child and, one of your friends, family members ask you, so where's Billy going to school? And you tell them a name of a school and the other person has no idea. And so you almost anticipate and just say, well, they're going to XYZ University. It's in, this little small town in the state of, and whatever it might be. And so that, unfortunately, is a big part of our decision making, is familiarity. I mean, think about it, everyone. You know why the company spends so much money on commercials and advertising? Because we get familiar with them, and so we choose that. But if we just slow down and think, right? We're still allowed to think, right? Millennials, think about this. And this is one of the things I love seeing with students, is they do think beyond just the labels. And I call it the Kirkland phenomenon because, of course, you guys all know by now, I love Costco. Kirkland signature products are a Costco brand. They're not a fancy name brand, right? But I think so many of us have recognized that, yes, it's not a glamorous name or a brand, but it does the job. I mean, we have Kirkland, toilet paper. We have Kirkland napkins. We have Kirkland batteries in my household. Why? Because they're a great value. They do what they're supposed to do. The Duracell, I mean, they're a little bit pricier. And my kids did a experiment to see, does the Duracell last much longer? And I don't remember the results, but I just remember it doesn't justify the extra cost of going with that. So we buy Kirkland. So when we're thinking about, okay, which school do we apply to, you focus on the difference. And then remember this, everyone, whether you're a med school in California, Arkansas, Texas, South Carolina, they have to undergo accreditation, right? There's a quality control. They want to make sure that that medical school has a quality of education and training that's going to prepare their students to be competent and, necessary physicians. Well, so the quality is going to be very comparable, but what's different? Location's different, right? You're either going to go to a school that's in a very hot, dry, humid, climate, or somewhere that snows and it's cold. I mean, so geography obviously is one of those things that are clear differences. Price, right? The price of the program, that's a big differentiator. So these are some of the things that students will look at. Now, I would argue probably even before that, what students look at when they're looking at med schools is GPA and test scores, right? And that's no different from high schoolers. I mean, when you're a high school senior, junior, you're not looking at the Ivy League school when you have a 2.3 GPA, right? I mean, I think if you're being realistic, you want to sort of find the fit for you. And that's the same thing with med schools. Med schools are like many other things in our society. It's supply and demand. The more people want to go there, the price tag is going to be higher. It is the seafood market price, right? I mean, I love fish. My family, we eat fish once a week. My kids know that halibut is a lot more expensive than tilapia. Why? Because the demand is greater than the supply. So in that same way, when you're talking about med schools, you got to think about what your needs are and what falls within your sort of position. Because again, if your GPA is such that, it's going to struggle, you're not going to be able to get a steak, a juicy prime ribeye steak for $1.99 a pound. That's just not feasible. I mean, occasionally you might be able to find it on sale. And the reason why I say that is occasionally you will have some students whose statistics, academic metrics are lower, right? They're lower than the published statistics of that medical school, but we're able to get in. And that just surely has to do with how statistics work. I mean, when we talk about averages, we all know that average is a central tendency, meaning that there are data points that are above it and below it, unless you believe that every single person who applied was at that data point. Then obviously that, and that's why you also want to look at median, right? This is not a stats class. I know this webinar is not a statistics, but you want to look at mean as well as median to get a sense of the standard deviation too. So sometimes, students will look at that and say, oh my gosh, somebody with this low GPA got into this really big, name medical school. That means I have a chance. Yeah, I mean, it does. Theoretically, everyone has a chance. But do you like those chances? Do you like those odds? And so all of this to say, when you're looking at the programs, you really want to look at the fit of what program is for me. What are my needs? Do I really need to go to a school that has all these fancy bells and whistles and, research requirement? There are some med schools that have a research requirement. Do you love research? Well, if you hate research and it makes you sad and depressed, why would you apply to a med school that has a research requirement? And just think about it this way, because this isn't just another fun sort of paradigm shift I love sharing with students. When it's that challenging and difficult for you, the student, and even the parents, when it's that confusing and like, how do you choose? I mean, there's hundreds of med schools. Which one do we choose? Just imagine what it must be like for those admission committee members on the other side of the desk when they're inundated with literally thousands of applicants. Who do they choose? Does that make sense? Like when you struggle to differentiate amongst hundreds of medical schools, just imagine how much more challenging it is for med schools to differentiate literally thousands of applicants. I mean, are they going to do it just straight based on GPA and MCAT scores, right? I mean, if so, they can give you an admission decision probably in less than a week. You just crunch the data. But that's not how it
program.
That's right.
We're turning the corner on this. I'm gonna try to get about two more questions. So one of them is, how do you figure out what path you want to take as a physician, whether you want to be a surgeon or
so that's another thing too. The data is very clear. A lot of students, when they get to med school, they really don't know, and they'll change their mind. I mean, it really is sort of when they get to med school, years 3 and 4, when they start rotating. They'll rotate through, psychiatry. They'll rotate through emergency. They'll rotate through all the different sort of areas of medicine. It is like sampling. You'll be there for, I mean, it depends. Some med schools, they might say you're there for 4 years. Some schools might have 6 weeks. And again, that's where the variations are. And so again, if you're someone who thinks, listen, I know for a fact I don't want to do psychiatry, well, then perhaps you shouldn't be applying to a school where they have their medical students rotate through psychiatry for 6 years. Now, obviously, that's a hypothetical because a lot of the primary specialty areas, almost all med schools will rotate their students through their primary care specialties. Okay. So, in terms of the specialty, I just tell, it's just, you're thinking about which plays you should run in the Super Bowl even before making the playoffs. It's just way too early. Just really figure out, do you even want to play football? And if you know you love football, figure out what position you might be good at and which one you want to play. Because the truth of the matter is, once you try out for the team, you might not get onto the team, or the coach might say, we'll take you, but I'm going to put you in a different position. And so that's kind of like when I, as an advisor and mentor, have worked with students that said, you're very bright, you're good in the sciences, but you know what? I think you might want to look into PhD research career, medical research route. And then some of them will, take my advice and they will, get into a lab and start doing some research. And I've had students come back and say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I love what I'm doing. I have a student who, so I'll give you a very concrete example. We were going over head transplant. I know it sounds really science fiction, but with technology these days. So the ability to take a head from one person and the body of another person and put it together, right? Look it up, you guys. Just look it up on Google. I mean, you'll see. Most of the students were, because we were talking about medical ethics in class. They're thinking about like, is that ethical? Should we do that? Should we not do that? Where does that person go for the holidays? Do they go to where the head came from, or do they follow where the body is from? I mean, we were kind of getting into the ethics of it. Whereas the student that was coming to me in office hours said, I'm fascinated. How do they reconnect the cranial nerves? How are they able to, reconnect the brainstem? They were really fascinated with the execution and ability to pull that off. So no surprise, that student went the PhD route in neuroscience. And I believe he's done with his PhD and he's probably, junior faculty somewhere. But again, it has to do with like, what do you like get excited about? What do you want to, do with your life is kind of what it boils down to. And the only way we know those things is by experiencing.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw a double question at you. Number one is, what stops most people from finishing medical school? Second is, how do we find out more information?
Sure. Absolutely. More information about what, Trevor?
About you.
About me? Oh, yeah, absolutely. So what is the number one barrier or causes for students? It's not academic reasons. It's very often personal reasons. Those are the causes that lead to students dropping out of med school. The U.S. has a ridiculously low attrition rate for med students. Why? Because you know how hard it is to get there? The time, money, sweat, blood, and tears that they've invested. So they're not going to change their mind and say, second thought, I don't think I want this. No, because there's a system that's set up where you really, have to want this bad enough that you spend so much of your life preparing for it. So I've traveled to Spain. I was in Spain before the pandemic, so maybe about 3 years ago, learning about their medical education system. They have a higher rate of attrition, along with a lot of other European countries. And it has nothing to do with the quality of the medical school. But it turns out that over there, and maybe some of your viewers here know this, in some of the other educational systems around the world, you go from high school straight into med school. So it's like undergrad, grad kind of rolled into one. So what you have are 18-year-olds who are in med school versus US, where you have 24-year-olds, 26-year-olds. So a much lower rate of attrition. Obviously, there's pros and cons to both types of systems. So the number one reason for preventing or impeding med students from graduating, it's usually personal reasons. Maybe something changed in their finances, something within their personal lives. It's not because of some academic reason. And as far as for more information, I do have a small private Facebook group that I just, it's kind of like my hobby. I enjoy sharing information. And if that's something that is of interest to your viewers, just email me at medschooladvising@gmail.com. And I'd be more than happy to send a link to that Facebook group. Once again, that's medschooladvising@gmail.com. And it's just a place where I get to post some of hot topics, current issues, very common questions. In fact, the students that are in that group love it. They say it's kind of like a library collection of all their questions. And that's true because, there is a consistency in the questions that most people have. Your question is common. And so again, this goes back to a lot of the work and the realities of information overload. It's not so much that you can't find information, but how do you differentiate what's reliable, what's accurate? And of course, how does it apply to me? Like, that's great. That's applicable for everybody. But what about for me? Because I need to know for my situation.
And then what's the next step? Let's say they watch this webinar and they learned a lot. What's the next step if they want to actually inquire about your actual services, like they want to hire you?
Yeah, they could just email me. I have I have a very busy schedule these days, especially right now because it's April. No, it's not even April, it's May. So the med school application systems are open, which means that everyone is scrambling. And yes, it is true. You want to apply early. It really is like, when you apply in the beginning, you're competing for all 150 seats that med school has. If you wait, now you're competing for fewer and fewer seats. So It is true. And so what I would recommend is just go ahead and email me and let me know what your situation is. If you've previously applied, I've worked with reapplicants as well. Some students who have applied and were unsuccessful, they'll have a printout of their previous cycle. And so I jokingly say, you know, I can do an autopsy, right? Continuing with sort of the medical jargon, we'll do an autopsy to figure out what happened, what went wrong, and figure out how you fix it. And you know, but take comfort in knowing that the percentage of applicants who are getting into med school second time around, it keeps increasing. So said in another way, don't be discouraged if you've already applied and you weren't successful. You know, it's just
the first time. Yeah, same thing for the military academies. You did a webinar on that too. Cool. Folks, this is honestly, like, I learned so much. I have so many questions that got crossed off as Dr. Kim was talking. So that's fantastic. You know where to find us. And you have Dr. Joon's information. Can you just repeat that email, Dr. Joon?
Yes, it is Med School Advising. So it's singular, med, MED, advising, ADVISING, at gmail.com. Med School Advising. So advising is also singular because I think sometimes we might mistakenly put an S, advisings or med schools. There's no S's. It's just med school advising at gmail.com.
All right, perfect, folks. Well, I'm going to close out the webinar. You guys have a great rest of the week.